You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Delphine O'Coin. I am 29 years old. I grew up in Livingston, Montana, but these days home is wherever I park. I do equine dental work on contract, floating teeth for ranch outfits scattered from the Bighorns up through the Dakotas, which means my calendar looks like a dartboard and my client list is mostly guys named Hank. I like it that way. I like not knowing exactly where I'll be sleeping on a Tuesday. The guy who usually knows where I'm sleeping is Rowan Kessler, 34, an iron worker who does structural welding on grain elevators and bridge retrofits. He's built like the job requires, quiet in a way that isn't unfriendly, just economical. We've been together 3 years, 6 months of that living in the van full time. He plans routes down to the gas station. I like getting lost. It works mostly because we take turns winning the argument. We've been circling South Dakota for a week, doing the tourist things, Badlands overlooks, the crowds at Mount Rushmore, a diner in Custer with pie that lived up to the sign out front. By day 5, we were both a little restless, the specific restlessness that comes from doing exactly what everyone else with a South Dakota bumper sticker does. Rowan pulled out a paper Forest Service map he'd picked up at a ranger station, the old kind with the contour lines, and traced a finger along a spider web of unmarked roads west of Deerfield Lake. Nobody's cousin has a story about those roads, he said. That was the whole pitch. It worked on both of us. We left Rapid City mid-morning, and the highway gave way to gravel by early afternoon, the black hills closing in green and dense on both sides, the kind of pine forest that swallows sound. We passed Deerfield Lake, glassy and empty of the pontoon boats we'd seen on the bigger lakes, just a couple of guys fishing off a dock who didn't look up. The road kept climbing and narrowing, washboard ruts under the tires, and I watched my phone lose its bars one at a time like a countdown nobody asked for. Rockford came and went in about 4 seconds. A handful of buildings, a bar with a hand-painted sign, maybe a dozen year-round residents according to a plaque we didn't stop to read closely. It's less a town than the idea of one, left over from a gold rush that fizzled a century ago. Past it, the road forgot it was a road. Grass grew up the middle of the ruts. Rowan eased off the gas and started reading the terrain instead of the map, which is his tell for when he's more focused than he's letting on. That's when I saw the spur cutting off to the north, barely wide enough for the van, and at the end of it, maybe 60 yards back in the trees, a cabin, not a ruin. It had a roofline that still held, a chimney still standing straight. Just abandoned looking in the way a lot of places out here are abandoned looking, whether they're occupied or not. I asked Rowan to pull in. He gave me the look he gives me before he agrees to something he thinks is a bad idea, and then he turned the wheel. We parked short of it and walked the rest. Up close, the cabin had a kind of care to it that undercut the abandonment. New chain and padlock on the door, plywood nailed clean and square over 2 of the 3 windows. The 3rd window was busted out, and something was hanging half through the gap, snagged on the frame, moving a little in a breeze I couldn't feel anywhere else. Hides, I told myself. Hunting camp, drying skins the lazy way. Rowan didn't say anything, which from him counts as a vote against my theory. The smell reached us before we got close enough to look properly. Thick, sweetish, wrong in a way that dead deer in a ditch isn't quite wrong. I've smelled plenty of rot doing ranch work. This had a density to it, like it was coming from more than one source. Rowan put a hand flat on my sternum. Not dramatic, just a habit for job sites to stop right there. We didn't get closer. We didn't need to. I took one photo on my phone without the flash, more reflex than decision, and we walked back to the van faster than we'd walked in. Neither of us wanted to say out loud that we were still going to camp somewhere out here, but neither of us suggested turning around either. Rowan drove maybe 2 kilometers past the turnoff, the road finally leveling and opening into a meadow along a creek, Castle Creek, according to the map, though nothing marked it out here. It was, without exaggeration, one of the prettier spots we'd found all trip. Grass to the knee, the creek talking to itself over rocks, the hills stacking up blue-green in every direction. Rowan said the cabin was somebody's business, not ours, and we should let it be. I let myself agree with him, mostly, and we backed the van in and started unloading for the night. The smell from the cabin still sitting somewhere behind my nose even after it should have faded. Dinner was pasta with the last of the good Parmesan, cooked on the fold-out stove with the creek going in the background, and it was for a while exactly the kind of evening we'd been chasing all week. Rowan realized halfway through cooking that he'd left our 5-gallon water jug back at the last fill-up station, which meant we were down to what was in our 2 bottles until morning. Not an emergency, just the kind of small screw-up that becomes a running joke between 2 people who've made 100 small screw-ups together already. I gave him grief about it. He took it fine. It felt normal, and normal felt good after the cabin. Somewhere past sunset, the elk started up, that long, rising bugle that sounds more like a hinge than an animal, echoing off the ridgeline in a way that made it impossible to tell how close they actually were. "September's rut season up here," Rowan said, like he was reading it off a placard, and for a few minutes we sat and listened to 2 different bulls answering each other across the valley, which is a genuinely strange and good sound if you've never heard it before. I hadn't. It almost pushed the smell of that cabin out of my head. I've had ringing in my ears since I was 22, a permanent souvenir from years of running a dental float without hearing protection before I knew better. And it means I sleep light, always half listening under the ringing for whatever's real. Rowan's the opposite. The man could sleep through a hailstorm. It's a decent division of labor most nights. That night, lying in the dark with the tinnitus doing its usual hum, I kept running the cabin back through my head instead of sleeping, which is its own kind of ringing. We still had 1 bar of signal, enough that curiosity got the better of me around 9, and I tried looking up the parcel. Pennington County GIS, property records, anything. The map loaded a blank green rectangle with no owner name attached. No permit history. Nothing. Rowan leaned over my shoulder and said maybe it just hadn't changed hands in decades, which counties sometimes don't bother updating. Probably true. It didn't feel true. It felt like a hole where information should have been, and holes like that tend to sit with me longer than they should. We turned in around 10, Rowan's arm heavy across me, the kind of tired that comes from a full day of driving and hiking and trying not to think about smells. He told me, half asleep already, that we'd be fine, that guys who padlock their own cabin in the middle of nowhere are usually just protecting a meth setup or a poaching operation, nothing that has any interest in 2 people camped 2 kilometers away. It was meant to be comforting. I remember thinking it wasn't quite the comfort he intended, and then I was asleep too. I woke sometime after 2 to a sound that took me a second to place because it wasn't the crack of a branch or footsteps and leaves. It was rhythmic and dragging, metal or something metal adjacent scraping against packed dirt at even intervals, like someone pulling a sled with a bad wheel. It stopped, started again. My heart was going before my brain had caught up to why. I shook Rowan awake without saying anything, just gripping his arm hard enough that he came up fast, alert in the particular way he gets on job sites when something's wrong with a load. I pointed toward the window. The clearing outside was lit up better than I expected. Close to a full moon, the grass silvered and the creek throwing back little chips of light. And for a second it looked almost peaceful, which made what I saw next feel like it was happening on the wrong stage entirely. At the tree lean, maybe 80 yards out, a man was walking, steady, unhurried, an axe held loose in one hand, blade down, and behind him, gripped by what looked like a boot or an ankle, something heavy dragged through the grass, leaving a dark, flattened track. I couldn't make out a face at that distance, only the shape of him and the shape of what he was pulling, both moving with the same terrible lack of urgency, like this was routine. Rowan's hand found mine in the dark and closed hard enough to hurt, and neither of us moved, barely breathed, watching the man and his cargo cut a diagonal line across the meadow toward the tree line on the far side, until the shapes folded into the dark between the trunks, and the dragging sound faded into the general hush of the creek, and the meadow went back to looking peaceful, which was somehow the worst part. We stayed frozen for what felt like 10 minutes, and was probably closer to, both of us doing the math on distance and sound, and whether the man had a reason to look back toward the van. Rowan finally whispered that we needed to go, now. Quiet. I didn't argue. I checked my phone out of pure reflex. 0 bars. Not even the one we'd had earlier, which meant whatever happened next, we were solving it ourselves. There was a brief, ugly little disagreement in whispers about whether quiet and slow, or fast and loud, was the safer play. Rowan wanted to ease out with the lights off and coast the first stretch. I wanted the engine running the second we were both inside, done arguing about it before we'd even started. We split the difference badly, which is what happens when 2 scared people try to compromise on physics. Packing took longer than it should have, because we were both trying to move without sound, which meant a lot of held breath and things set down half an inch at a time. I knocked a metal cup off the counter reaching for my shoes, and it hit the floor of the van with a clatter that felt, in that silence, roughly as loud as a car crash. We both went still, listening past the ringing in my ears and the creak, and heard nothing new. That didn't feel like reassurance so much as a stay of execution. By the time we were both dressed and gathering the last of it, the far tree had gone quiet. No more dragging, no visible movement, nothing to track. I wanted to believe that meant he'd gone wherever he was going and stayed there. Rowan wanted to actually see the man leave before we did anything else, which meant a few more minutes of crouching by the window watching an empty meadow, both of us hating the delay and neither of us willing to be the one who rushed it. We agreed to go. Rowan reached for the ignition and swore under his breath. His keys weren't in the cup holder where he always leaves them, because he'd used them to weight down a paper plate by the fire pit outside earlier and never brought them back in. He was out the door and across the grass in a crouch run before I could tell him not to, and I sat alone in the van for the longest 90 seconds of the trip so far, watching the dark tree for any change in shape. While he was gone, I noticed something pale in the grass a few feet from the sliding door. Caught on the edge of the dome light, I didn't dare turn all the way up. I eased the door open enough to reach it without stepping out. A wallet, water swollen, the leather gone soft and dark. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. It told me plenty just sitting there, and I pulled it inside and set it on the dash like it might do something if I let it out of my sight. Rowan came back low and fast with the keys, breathing hard, and didn't ask about the wallet, just saw my face and decided this wasn't the moment. He got us started, and the dome light flared on for the half-second the door was open before easing shut. One bright yellow flash against all that dark that felt like it could be seen from a mile off. We rolled forward slow. No headlights yet. Both of us leaning toward the windshield like that would help us see better. The road demanded headlights within the first 100 yards. Too many ruts, a drop-off on the right side we both remembered but couldn't have found blind. So Rowan flipped them on, and we committed to being visible, trading stealth for speed, easing through the tight curves as fast as the gravel would let us. My hand were flat against the dash like bracing would help anything. We were maybe a half mile down the spur, almost back to where it met the wider road, when the headlights swept across a figure standing dead center in the ruts ahead of us, still watching us come, an axe hanging easy at his side like he had all the time we didn't. Rowan didn't slow down. He cut the wheel hard right into what turned out to be a shallow pull-off, clipping a sapling that cracked against the side mirror, and the man was a blur at the edge of my vision as we blew past him close enough that I felt my whole body brace for an impact that never came. In the side mirror, I watched him turn to track us, unhurried, which was somehow worse than if he'd run. The road threw a down lodgepole across both ruts about 200 yards later, silver and long dead, clearly not something that had fallen in the last 10 minutes, which meant either it had been there the whole time, and we'd missed it driving in the other direction, or someone had dragged it there on purpose while we slept. Rowan swore, threw it in reverse, and cut onto a fainter track branching off to the left that he swore he remembered from the map, going purely on instinct now, instead of anything printed on paper. The instinct was wrong, or the map was wrong, or both. 20 minutes of climbing switchbacks put us at a rusted gate chained across the road, an old mine claim marker leaning sideways next to it, and beyond the gate nothing but more forest and no way through for the van. We'd driven ourselves into a pocket with one way in and no way out, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that maybe that had been the point of the fallen tree all along. We left the van and went on foot, which felt like giving something up, but wasn't actually a choice anymore. Rowan had clocked a fire lookout tower marked on the paper map hours earlier, back when it was just trivia, a spot called Custer Peak a mile or so off through the trees by his red of the contour lines. And a tower meant height, and height meant we could see anything coming before it saw us. It was a plan built out of nothing but a hunch and a piece of paper, and it was the only plan we had. The climb was worse than either of us expected in the dark. No trail, just deadfall and loose scree, my ankle rolling hard on a rock I didn't see, a cut opening on Rowan's forearm from a branch he walked into at full speed. We didn't stop to tend to any of it. Adrenaline is a decent painkiller for about 20 minutes, and we were both running on the tail end of it by the time the tower's silhouette finally broke the tree above us. Black lattice against the sky, just barely starting to gray at the edges. The stairs had rotted through in places, whole sections missing, And what should have taken 30 seconds took closer to 5 minutes of testing boards with our weight before committing to them. There was a decision buried in that climb that neither of us said out loud. That going up meant no second exit, that we'd be choosing a place with exactly one way down. We went up anyway, because down at ground level had already proven it had no good options either. We heard the ATV before we saw any light from it. A two-stroke whine winding through the trees below, cutting off and starting again like it was searching methodically rather than driving a route. A few minutes later, farther off, a dog started up, not barking randomly, but with that focused, working rhythm of a hound that's caught something and is telling its handler exactly where. Neither sound was close yet. Both were getting closer. Rowan made the call before I could talk him out of it. Said if we split up, whoever was tracking would have to choose, and better odds than staying bunched up in a fixed spot, he could search top to bottom. I told him no, and he was already halfway back down the rotten stairs by the time I finished saying it. Flashlight off, moving toward the ATV sound instead of away from it, drawing it like you draw a bull away from someone still in the pen. I climbed the rest of the way alone, every step sending a jolt through my bad ankle, and got low against the platform railing at the top, just as his flashlight beam. He clicked it back on, deliberately 100 yards off and moving away from me through the trees, winked out completely behind a ridge of pine, and I was alone in the dark with the ATV, whine, circling somewhere below, and no way to know which direction it had turned. I stayed flat against that platform for what my phone's dead clock later told me must have been close to 3 hours, though it felt like it had no length at all, just one continuous held breath. The wood was cold through my clothes. My ankle had swollen enough that I couldn't feel my own pulse in it anymore, just a dull, constant pressure. I didn't call out. I didn't move except to breathe. Dawn was still a rumor at the edge of the sky. Twice I heard something that might have been voices, pitched too low to carry words, coming from somewhere down and to the east, and once worse, a sound I didn't want to identify and didn't let myself sit with, short, sharp, over fast, swallowed by the trees before the echo could tell me anything more about where it came from or what had made it. After that, nothing. No engine. No dog. Just the wind starting to move through the tower's lattice with a low, steady hum that filled in where all the other sound had been. The silence went on long enough that I started arguing with myself about it. Whether it meant safety or meant I'd simply lost the ability to track anything moving out there, whether going down to look for Rowan was brave or was just going to finish whatever the night had started. I didn't have a good answer. I had a bad ankle, a dead phone, and a wallet on the dashboard of a van a mile away that I couldn't get back to without walking past everything I climbed up here to avoid. Gray light finally came in slow, the kind that takes an hour to become useful, and somewhere in that hour I caught a flash of white through gaps in the canopy to the south. A truck, moving on what had to be a maintained road, too far to hear, yet, but real, a color the forest doesn't produce on its own. I made the decision before I'd finished making it, already easing down those rotten stairs on a leg that screamed at every step. The van was where we'd left it, untouched as far as I could tell in the flat morning light, which should have been a relief, and mostly wasn't, because it meant Rowan hadn't made it back to it either. I called his name until my voice gave out, working a slow circle out from the vehicle, and found, maybe 40 yards into the trees, his jacket, torn at one shoulder, a dark stain gone stiff along the collar, snagged on a branch like it had been pulled off in mid-stride. I didn't find him. I want to be exact about that, because for a long time afterward people asked me what I found, and I never had a clean answer that satisfied them or me. I found a jacket. I found a scuffed patch of pine duff that could have been a struggle or could have been nothing. I did not find Rowan, and 3 hours of searching alone on a ruined ankle wasn't going to change that. So I did the only useful thing left, which was walk out toward that white truck and flag it down. It turned out to belong to a Forest Service contractor doing culvert checks, a woman about my mother's age who took one look at me, filthy, limping, half coherent, and got on a radio before I'd finished the first sentence of an explanation that didn't sound believable even to me. Search and rescue came out that afternoon. They found the van, the jacket, the wallet I'd left on the dash. They did not find the cabin. 2 different teams walked the coordinates I gave them off memory and satellite images, and both came back, describing an empty clearing with no structure on it at all, like the whole thing had been packed up and hauled off between the night I saw it and the morning they went looking. Rowan was never found. Pennington County keeps his file open in the technical sense, which is a phrase I've come to understand means very little in practice. I gave my statement 4 times to 4 different people, and somewhere around the third telling, I stopped expecting anyone to fully believe the acts, specifically, which is the detail that always makes people's faces do a particular thing. I don't blame them for it. I saw it, and some nights, I still have trouble believing it myself. I still work the same circuit of ranches, still sleep in a van most nights, because it turns out grief doesn't actually care where you park it. What's changed is small and specific. I check every lock twice now. I keep the engine running longer than I used to before committing to a campsite. And every so often, on a still night with the windows cracked, I'll catch myself sitting up, fully awake, listening hard for a rhythmic, dragging sound that isn't there, waiting to find out if this time it stops before it reaches me, or if this time it doesn't. My name is Marguerite Solano. I am 52 years old. I spent 26 years as an ER nurse in Sioux Falls before I retired early, sold the house, and moved into a van with a propane heater and more secondhand camera gear than either of us really needed. People assume that decision came from burnout, and it did, some, but mostly it came from watching too many patients say some version of, "I always meant to see more of this state from a gurney." I decided not to wait for the gurney. The gear belongs to Deacon Whitlock, 45, a former state park ranger who left the job to chase what he calls unexplained America for a modest but genuinely devoted online following. Old asylums, ghost towns, roadside oddities, places with a reputation that outlasts whatever actually happened there. We've been friends since nursing school, back when he was pre-med and reconsidering. And somewhere along the way, let's take a road trip sometime, turned into an actual arrangement. I drive, he shoots, we split gas and groceries. No romance involved, just 2 people who trust each other enough to be strange together. Deacon had circled a spot in Roberts County for months before we finally routed toward it. Sika Hollow, a stretch of wooded ravine on the edge of the Coteau de Prairies where the local legend runs deep and specific. Water that runs red, ground that hums underfoot in certain spots. A name that translates, depending on who you ask, to something like evil or bad spirits, courtesy of the Sisseton Wahpeton, people who've lived alongside it far longer than the state park designation has existed. Deacon had science-why answers ready for most of it. Iron-oxidizing bacteria for the red water, decomposing stumps that glow faintly with foxfire, and a look on his face that said the answers didn't fully satisfy him either. We came in from Sisseton in the late afternoon, the land flattening out into that big sky prairie plateau that doesn't look like it should hide anything, right up until the road drops into the wooded draw and the temperature seems to fall 5 degrees in about 30 seconds. The park itself doesn't allow overnight camping, which for us mostly meant finding a legal pull-off just outside the boundary line, close enough to hike in at dusk with Deacon's cameras, far enough to technically be somewhere else if a ranger came by. The creek lived up to its reputation the second we saw it, a rust-red ribbon threading through the ravine bottom. Genuinely startling, even knowing the bacterial explanation going in, the kind of color that makes your body react a half-second before your brain catches up with the chemistry. Deacon was thrilled. I was more interested in how quiet the whole place was. No birds working the canopy the way they should have been at that hour. Just the creek and our own footsteps in the leaf litter. We were maybe 40 minutes into a slow walk along the marked trail, Deacon getting his shots, when I noticed a second path branching off the official one. No signage, no park markers, just a deliberately cleared line through the underbrush, packed down by regular foot traffic rather than the occasional hiker. Small objects hung from a low branch at the fork, bundles of dried grass, a few feathers, nothing overtly threatening, more like something you'd find at a roadside shrine, except nobody official had put it there. Deacon, being Deacon, wanted to follow it, camera already up before I'd finished saying maybe we shouldn't. We compromised on a short distance, far enough to satisfy him. Not so far we'd lose the light. 200 yards in, the unmarked path opened into a small clearing with a ring of fire-blackened stones at its center, ash still loose enough to suggest recent use, and a rough wooden frame lashed together nearby that neither of us wanted to look at too directly or discuss out loud yet. We backed out the way we'd come, quieter than we'd walked in, and made it back to the main trail without incident, though I noticed Deacon checking over his shoulder more than his usual documentary instincts would explain. Neither of us said the word cold out loud on the walk back to the van. It sat there anyway, Unspoken the whole way. We got back to the pull-off with maybe an hour of daylight left, decided, over my mild objection, to stay put one more night rather than lose the whole trip over a fire pit that could have belonged to any number of harmless people, and set up camp with the kind of quiet, deliberate normalness that happens when two people are both pretending not to be a little unsettled. Dinner was quick and mostly silent, the good kind of silence at first, both of us processing the clearing in our own way. Deacon started reviewing the day's photos on his camera screen, and I caught him lingering too long on a wide shot of the wooden frame, zooming in on details he hadn't consciously noticed while shooting it. He didn't share what he was looking at. I didn't ask. Some things are better left for daylight conversation. Full dark came on fast under the tree cover, and Deacon, entirely on autopilot, set up his tripod at the edge of our sight for a long exposure shot of the stars cutting through the canopy gap above us, the kind of shot his followers expect, and clipped on the small red focus light he uses to check composition without blowing out his night vision. It's a habit of his I'd never thought twice about anywhere else we'd camped. Out here, that little red pinprick sat in the dark like a signal flare, visible, I guess, a good quarter-mile down the ravine. I've spent enough overnight shifts trusting a gut feeling about a patient before the monitors caught up to trust the one I had sitting by that fire, a sense of being cataloged rather than simply unseen. I mentioned it to Deacon. He said I was projecting the clearing onto an empty forest, not unkindly, and went back to checking a shot. We'd have this exact disagreement again within the hour, with considerably higher stakes. It started as sound before it became anything else. A low, rhythmic percussion, hand drums maybe, carried up the ravine on air that was otherwise dead still, faint enough that for a full minute we both convinced ourselves we were imagining it. Then a dull, orange glow bloomed through the tree trunk's downslope, flickering the specific way a large fire flickers. Not a lantern, not headlights. Deacon was already reaching for his camera before I'd finished processing what I was looking at. We argued in whispers for longer than we should have. Deacon wanted footage, actual proof of something instead of a fire pit and a feeling, and I wanted to be anywhere else on the North American continent. We compromised again, worse this time. We'd go far enough to see, no closer, out and back in 15 minutes. I went on record that I knew, even as I agreed to it, that this was the kind of decision people make right before the part of the story where things go wrong. We picked our way down through the trees using the drumbeat as a guide rather than any real path, ending up on a low rise maybe 80 yards above the clearing we'd found earlier, now transformed. A bonfire throwing long shadows, a dozen or more robed figures moving in a loose, unhurried circle around it, low chanting under the drums that I couldn't make into words and didn't want to. At the center, near the wooden frame from that afternoon, something had been added to it that neither of us could fully make out from that distance, and neither of us has ever fully agreed on since. A shape, roughly human in scale, still or nearly still, that the figures seemed to be arranging rather than harming, though the distinction felt thin, and I've never been confident which side of it we were actually watching. Deacon had his camera up, shutter clicking soft and slow, when one of the robed figures near the fire's edge went still mid-step and turned its head directly toward our rise, not scanning, not searching, looking like it already knew exactly where to look. I grabbed Deacon's sleeve hard enough that his next frame came out blurred, and we were moving back up the slope before either of us said a word, branches taking the sound of our retreat whether we wanted them to or not. We didn't run, so much as move very fast while try to convince our bodies it wasn't running, all the way back to the van, both of us breathing too hard to talk, the drums behind us never once breaking rhythm, which somehow made the whole climb worse than if they'd stopped. We got the van door shut and locked before either of us said anything coherent, and my first real thought once my pulse settled enough to think at all was that we needed to be on the road inside of 5 minutes. No packing, no plan beyond distance. Deacon agreed with a speed that told me he'd been thinking the exact same thing the entire climb up. He got maybe 2 words into starting the van before he stopped cold and said the camera bag, his camera bag, the one with tonight's footage, was still on the ground where he'd set it during our whispered argument at the top of the rise, left behind in the scramble to get back. I told him to forget it. He said the footage on it could identify us or the site or both if the wrong hands ended up with it eventually. And honestly, sitting here now, I think he was right to worry, even if I hated every second of the conversation that followed. We spent almost 2 full minutes arguing about whether to go back for it. Deacon making the case that leaving it behind was worse in the long run. Me making the case that nothing on a memory card was worth what we just watched turn its head toward us. We didn't resolve it so much as run out of time to keep arguing, because headlights, real ones, a truck's worth, swept across the trees on the access road behind us, moving slow, clearly searching rather than passing through. Deacon killed our interior lights, and we sat frozen while the truck idled at the mouth of our pull-off for what felt like an unreasonable length of time, before continuing on, taillights disappearing around the bend toward the main park road. And I understood in that moment that we weren't dealing with one person's fire circle in the woods. We were dealing with something organized enough to have vehicles and a search pattern, and that changed the math on everything, including the camera bag. Question, which I abruptly lost. We backed out without headlights, feeling our way along the gravel by moonlight alone, both of us flinching at every pop of a rock under the tires like it was a gunshot. The access road only ran one direction back toward the highway, which meant if that truck had gone the other way looking for us, we were about to drive straight past wherever it ended up. There wasn't a better option available. We made it maybe half a mile before the road forced a decision. A set of headlights parked broadside across the gravel ahead, blocking it entirely. Engine idling, no attempt at concealment, which told me they wanted to be seen exactly as much as they wanted to stop us. Deacon threw the van into reverse hard enough that I nearly went into the dash, and we backed at speed until the road offered a rutted farm cutoff to the east that neither of us had scouted and both of us took anyway. The cutoff dead-ended, inevitably, at a fence line and a lock gate we had no way through, no time to find another route, and the sound of a second engine now audible behind us on the cutoff we just driven up, close enough the headlights would round the bend within a minute or two at most. Deacon made the call this time, faster than I liked, and probably better than anything I would have come up with. We go on foot, back toward the hollow itself rather than away from it, on the theory that whoever these people were, they'd built their whole operation around a place locals still treated as cursed ground, and there was at least a chance that superstition cut both ways. We left the van running with the lights off as a decoy, and went over the fence and into the trees on foot, the drumbeat we'd been running from all night now. Strangely, the only sound out there that told us which direction to avoid. The hollow at night, without a trail to follow, was a different animal than the hollow at dusk with a marked path under our feet. Root systems that grabbed at ankles. Ground that genuinely did feel softer and wetter in patches the way Deacon's research had warned, and the Red Creek itself, which we hit within 10 minutes and which looked, in moonlight, less like mineral water and more like exactly what the legend always claimed it was, regardless of what either of us knew to be scientifically true. I went down hard crossing a slick section of bank, my knee catching a root wrong, and came up with a gash along my shin and a joint that wasn't going to bear full weight comfortably again that night. 26 years in an ER means I know exactly how to assess an injury like that with a flashlight and no supplies, which is a strange kind of comfort to lean on while also being chased through the woods. I cataloged it, decided it wasn't disabling, and kept moving because the alternative wasn't available. Flashlight beams started sweeping the tree line behind us within another few minutes, moving with a kind of coordinated spacing that meant more than one searcher working a pattern, not a random sweep. Deacon pulled us off the creek and up on a higher, drier ground, reasoning that the group's own comfort zone probably centered on the water and the clearing, and that putting distance from both was our best shot even if it meant harder terrain. We found a shallow depression behind a fallen oak, root ball taller than either of us, and went still there rather than keep moving blind, both of us judging, correctly, I think, that continued motion in unfamiliar dark was more likely to give us away than staying low and letting searchers pass. My knee throbbed in time with my pulse. Deacon's hand found my shoulder once, briefly, the closest either of us came to acknowledging out loud how bad this had gotten. A beam passed within maybe 20 feet of our depression, voices low and unhurried behind it, and I heard, for the first time all night, actual words rather than chanting. Someone saying the word gone, someone else saying something back I couldn't parse, both voices carrying more irritation than menace, which somehow did nothing to make me feel better. They moved on, the beams sweeping wide and away toward the creek, and we stayed frozen along while past when it was strictly necessary, because neither of us trusted our own judgment about when close enough was actually far enough. The drums had stopped sometime in the last 20 minutes, which felt less like relief and more like the absence of information we'd been using to track them. Deacon finally decided we needed to move again before my knee stiffened past usable, and we worked our way further from the creek, uphill, using a compass app on his phone that somehow still had battery, even with no signal, angling roughly toward where we both remembered the state highway running along the plateau above the ravine. We came up out of the tree line a little before 4 in the morning onto open prairie grass, cold and soaked through, and both of us limping in different ways, with the highway visible as a thin gray line, maybe half a mile off across open ground that offered no cover at all if anyone was still looking, which was its own particular kind of exposed I hadn't accounted for until we were already standing in it. We crossed that half mile of open prairie the slowest either of us has ever moved, with genuine urgency behind it. My knee buckling twice, Deacon half carrying me the last stretch, both of us watching the tree line behind for lights that never came. Whatever had been searching for us down in the hollow either lost interest at the water's edge or decided the open ground wasn't worth the exposure. I've never settled on which explanation I believe more. We hit the highway shoulder as the sky was starting to go from black to that flat early gray, and stood there long enough to genuinely wonder if we'd have to walk the whole way to Sisseton before a pickup slowed and stopped. An older man, Sisseton Wahpeton, on his way to check trot lines before sunup, who took one look at the two of us, soaked and bleeding and shaking, and didn't ask a single question before telling us to get in. He didn't seem surprised by much of what I managed to explain on the drive in, which told me plenty on its own. Said the hollow had a long history of people going in for a thrill and coming out different, or not coming out at all, and that tribal and county authorities had chased rumors out there before without much to show for it. He dropped us at a clinic in Sisseton and left before I got his name properly, which is a regret I still carry. County officers took a statement that afternoon, polite and thorough, and visibly skeptical the moment I got to the fire circle and the shape at its center, though the abandoned van, the gash on my knee, and Deacon's obvious injuries kept them from writing the whole thing off outright. A search team went into the hollow within the day. They found our van exactly where we'd left it, engine dead from an empty tank, doors still locked. They found the fire circle, cold ash consistent with recent use. They did not find the wooden frame we'd seen twice, once empty and once not. They did not find robes, drums, footprints beyond our own confirmed trail, or Deacon's camera bag, despite 2 full days of searching the area we described as precisely as either of us could manage. Whatever had been out there had either moved everything in the hours after we fled, or, and I say this understanding exactly how it sounds, hadn't left the kind of evidence that search teams are built to find. Deacon's footage existed, at least, on a card he'd swapped out and pocketed before the argument over the bag, a fact he hadn't mentioned to me until we were both safe, which I understand now as his own version of the mistakes I've been making all night. The recovered clips are dark, shaky, mostly useless to anyone who wasn't there, though he's shown them to exactly no one outside the two of us, and I don't expect that to change. The case, such as it is, remains open in the way these things tend to stay open, a file, a location flagged, no arrests, no names, nothing to prosecute, even if there were. Deacon eventually published a piece about Sika Hollow that stuck carefully to the historical legend and left out everything that happened to us specifically, which I understood without him explaining it. Some stories don't survive being told the way they actually happened. I healed. The knee still complains before it rains, which the nurse in me finds almost funny given everything else it could have decided to remember instead. Deacon and I still travel together, though we've both gotten quieter about unmarked trails, and quicker to leave a place the first time it feels like it's watching back rather than the third or fourth. I found, weeks later, doing laundry, a small stone in my jacket pocket that I have no memory of picking up, smooth, river-worn, stained a deep rust red clean through rather than just on the surface, the kind of color that shouldn't survive a wash cycle and didn't fade one bit after several. I've moved it from pocket to pocket, jacket to jacket, ever since. I haven't been able to make myself throw it out, and I haven't been able to explain that to anyone, including myself, in a way that sounds like anything other than what it probably is. My name is Ren Colfax. I am 27 years old. I'm a PhD candidate in paleoecology, 3 years into a dissertation on Pleistocene climate signals preserved in sediment layers, which is a fancier way of saying I dig small holes in old dirt and get excited about the color changes. My advisor secured me a backcountry research permit for the Sage Creek Wilderness area inside Badlands National Park, and I've been planning the sampling trip for 2 months before my father invited himself along. My father is Emmett Colfax, 58, a retired petroleum geologist who spent 30 years reading rock for oil companies and has spent the 8 months since retirement mostly reading rock for fun, which he insists isn't as different as I make it sound. He'd never actually seen the Badlands up close despite having consulted on formations half the country over, and framed the trip as a professional curiosity rather than what I suspect it actually was. An excuse to spend 4 days with his daughter before she disappeared back into the version of adulthood that doesn't leave much room for that. We picked up my backcountry permit at the visitor center outside wall, where a young ranger walked us through the rules with the specific patience of someone who's had to explain the same thing to a lot of overconfident tourists. Pack out everything, no fires, and the one line she repeated twice for emphasis: if the sky turns on you out there, the clay turns with it, and you do not want to be driving on gumbo once it's wet. My father nodded along like a man taking notes on something he already half understood. I wrote it down anyway. The drive off the paved loop road and onto the gravel of Sage Creek Rim Road dropped us into a landscape that still doesn't feel entirely real to me, even having spent 2 prior field seasons in it. Buttes striped in bands of red and tan and gray-white, eroded into shapes that looked deliberate, like ruins of something that was never actually built. My father kept the window down the whole drive, narrating the exposed strata to himself in a low, satisfied mutter I've been hearing my whole life and still find comforting. We found a flat spot to make camp a little before 4, tucked along the dry, sandy bottom of a side wash feeding into Sage Creek proper. Good wind shelter, level ground, an easy walk to 2 of my sampling sites. My father picked the exact spot, citing 30 years of reading terrain for a living, and I noted, the way you note something without acting on it, that camping in a wash bottom wasn't strictly what our permit briefing had recommended. I let it go. He'd earned some benefit of the doubt. We spent the afternoon at my first sample site, him holding equipment and asking better questions than most of my actual field partners, the 2 of us falling into an easy rhythm that made the whole trip feel exactly like what I'd hoped it would be. He had opinions about my core samples that were occasionally right and occasionally 30 years out of date, and I gave him grief about both in roughly equal measure, which is our normal register and always has been. By early evening, thunderheads had started stacking up along the western horizon, distant enough that neither of us treated them as more than scenery. The kind of dramatic sky that looks incredible in Badlands light and usually stays exactly where it is until well after dark. My father, professionally unbothered, said we had hours before anything reached us, if it reached us at all, and started setting up the camp stove for dinner. We ate with the sky doing something genuinely beautiful behind us, layered orange and violet over the striped buttes, and for a while the distant thunder was just texture, a low rolling sound with no immediate claim on us. I remember thinking specifically that this was the trip I'd wanted, my dad in his element, me and mine, nothing between us but good rock and easy conversation. By full dark the thunder had a different character to it, closer together, less like ambience and more like a countdown. And the wind that had been at our backs all evening swung around hard enough to flatten the stove flame and send my father up to double-check the tent stakes, his geologist's cheerfulness finally giving way to something more focused, which is usually when I start paying closer attention to him. The rain announced itself as a wall rather than a build-up, a specific sound moving toward us across the open ground that we both recognized a full 10 seconds before it actually hit. And then it hit, hard, cold, immediate, driving sideways in the wind, turning our headlamp beams into solid cones of falling water. We got in the van fast, gear half secured, both of us soaked through in the run between tent and door. For the first 20 minutes it felt manageable, even a little exciting in the way storms are when you're safe inside something. My father cracking jokes about his own campsite choice, me half watching the wash out the window by lightning flash, still dry-bottomed as far as I could tell, just a dark channel of sand catching the rain. I'd flagged the wash bottom camp earlier and let it go. I didn't let it go a second time and told him, flat out, that we needed to think about moving the tent to higher ground before this got worse rather than after. He agreed. Eventually, after another few minutes of lightning-lit reconnaissance through the windshield that cost us more time than either of us meant to spend, and by the time we actually opened the doors to go move gear, the character of the wash had changed in a way that stopped both of us cold. A thin, fast sheet of water, now running the length of the channel, pale and churning in our headlamps, rising by visibly measurable amounts between one lightning flash and the next. We didn't discuss it. We just moved, grabbing what we could reach fastest, the tense rainfly, my sample cases, the stove, while the water kept climbing, no longer a sheet, but a current now, dragging at our ankles as we waded the last stretch back toward the van, the ground beneath us going from sand to a slick, sucking clay that grabbed at every step like it had opinions about us leaving. My father went down hard about 10 feet from the van, one leg buckling sideways on the newly slick clay, and I heard the sound before I understood it. Not a crack, more of a wet, wrong give, followed by him, making a noise I'd never heard him make in 27 years of knowing him, short and involuntary, cut off almost as soon as it started because he was already trying to get back up. I got an arm under him, and we made the last stretch together, badly, both of us going down once more in the mud before we hauled ourselves and what gear we'd managed to save into the van, rain hammering the roof loud enough that talking required raising our voices, even inside, and I got my first real look at his leg in the dome light, swollen fast at the knee, already discoloring, weight-bearing clearly out of the question. The wash outside the window had become, in the space of maybe 15 minutes, an actual moving body of water, brown and fast, and carrying visible debris, branches, what might have been our folding table, things I didn't examine closely enough to identify, and I understood, watching it, exactly how much worse the last 20 minutes could have gone if we'd waited even a little longer to move. We were stuck on a narrow rise between two arms of rising water, not fully an island, but close enough to feel like one. The van's tires already sunk to the hubs in clay that had gone from solid ground to something closer to wet cement in under half an hour. Engine useless, even if either of us had been foolish enough to try it in that current. There wasn't a decision left to make at that point beyond staying put and getting my father's leg stabilized as best I could with what was in the van, both of us soaked and shaking, listening to the water keep rising somewhere close enough outside that I stopped being able to tell, after a while, whether the sound was getting louder or I was just getting more used to being afraid of it. I got my father's boot off and his leg elevated on the console between the seats, using a rolled-up jacket as a splint brace, and every scrap of first aid training that 10 years around fieldwork injuries had actually stuck with me, while he alternated between wincing instructions on his own care and apologizing for the campsite choice in a way I finally had to tell him to stop doing, because we needed him steady more than we needed him sorry. The rain kept up in pulses rather than a steady sheet for the next hour, easing enough at times to hear the water outside more clearly, then slamming back down hard enough to drown out conversation entirely. And somewhere in that hour a lightning strike hit close enough that the flash and the crack arrived essentially together, close enough that the hair on my arm stood up and my father, despite the leg, physically flinched his whole upper body. He talked me through it in that same low geologist mutter, half explaining and half just needing to say something out loud. How the exposed rise we were parked on was probably about the worst place to be for a nearby strike. How we should be doing the crouch and spread thing he half remembered from some old safety briefing. How none of that mattered much if the van itself took a direct hit, which it didn't, though 2 more strikes in the next 20 minutes came close enough that I stopped, being able to tell if my heart rate was ever actually coming back down. Somewhere past midnight, the worst of it finally passed, the strikes spacing out, the rain thinning to something almost gentle by comparison, and I used the lull to check on the wash. The water still moving, but visibly lower than its peak, the immediate danger of it reaching the van apparently behind us, which felt like the first genuinely good news of the night, and I let myself feel it for about 30 seconds before turning back to my father's leg, which had swollen enough by then that I was fairly sure we were dealing with more than a bad sprain. We had no signal, hadn't had any since the rim road, and wouldn't until we reached higher ground closer to the developed part of the park, which put us in the position of knowing exactly what we needed. Evacuation, ideally with a medic, and having no way to request it beyond getting there ourselves on foot, with one of us barely able to stand. I tried the engine once around 2 in the morning out of stubbornness more than hope, and got exactly what I expected. Wheels spinning uselessly in clay that had the consistency of thick pudding, no traction anywhere, the van settling a half-inch deeper for the effort, which told me everything I needed to know about whether we'd be driving out in the morning, even after the sun came up and started drying things. My father slept in restless stretches after that, pain and adrenaline trading off, and I stayed awake watching the water outside slowly lose its urgency, thinking through the geography of getting two of us, one significantly disabled, the several miles back to anywhere a ranger might actually find us, running through options I didn't love any version of. By first light, the wash had dropped to something closer to its normal dry season self, if you didn't count the churned mud, the scattered debris, and the raw, freshly cut banks where the flood had chewed several feet deeper into the clay overnight, exposing pale layers of rock that hadn't seen daylight in what my father, even flat on his back and in obvious pain, couldn't help but identify by formation name. The van wasn't moving, the leg wasn't improving on its own, and the morning sun was already starting to bake the surface of the drying clay into something that looked deceptively solid and would, I already suspected from 2 prior field seasons out here, turn back into a trap the moment enough weight tested it, which meant our best and possibly only real option was to start walking while the ground still allowed it all. I rigged a crutch out of a tent pole and a folded jacket for padding, and we started out a little after 7. My father's pace dictated entirely by how much weight he could put on the good leg before the pain got ahead of him, which turned out to be not very much, not for long stretches at a time. What should have been a 2-hour walk to the nearest point with reliable signal was already looking, within the first mile, like it was going to take most of the day. The ground fought us the whole way. Patches of drying gumbo that looked stable and weren't, sucking a boot down to the ankle without warning, alternating with stretches baked hard enough by the returning sun to be genuinely difficult on an injured leg. We were both drinking water faster than either of us liked. Our supply meant for one dry day, not a storm and a rescue hike stacked on top of it. And every side channel we passed ran the same undrinkable brown as the main wash had overnight. We came around the shoulder of a low butte a little past 10 and found our path blocked by something I'd seen before at a comfortable distance, and never this close. A scattered group of bison, maybe 15 animals, grazing the wet grass at the base of the rise, several of them clearly agitated by the storm still, tails up, one bull pawing at the ground in a way I recognized from every ranger warning I'd ever half listened to about giving them room. My father, even hobbled, had the presence of mind to grab my arm and pull us back behind the rise before either of us got close enough to register as a threat. And we sat there for a long, tense stretch working out an alternate route that added the better part of a mile to a walk we were already struggling to finish, both of us watching the herd over our shoulders the entire detour like it might change its mind about us. The detour put us against a side channel still running fast enough from the overnight flood that fording it straight on wasn't a reasonable option, not with my father's leg, and we spent nearly 40 minutes working our way upstream along the bank looking for a narrower crossing, my father leaning hard on me the whole way, both of us increasingly aware of how much daylight and water we were burning on a route that kept refusing to cooperate. We found a crossing eventually, narrow enough to manage but still fast, and I went first without him, testing footing, then came back for him, and the crossing itself took maybe 90 seconds and felt like it took 10 minutes, the current dragging harder at our legs than either of us expected, my father's bad leg buckling once in the middle of it in a way that nearly took us both down into water that would not have been forgiving. We made the far bank soaked to the chest, my father grayer in the face than I liked, and we sat for a longer rest than I wanted to allow, both of us aware that stopping too long invited its own problems. Heat, dehydration, the simple fact that every hour we weren't found was an hour more that could go wrong in some new direction neither of us had planned for. My father, working an idea he'd apparently been chewing on since the crossing, pulled the small mirrored rock hammer he uses for field work out of his pack, a tool with a polished steel face he'd normally use for testing street color on samples, and suggested, with the kind of stubborn practicality that's gotten him through 30 years of remote field work, that we use it to signal anything moving on the rim road above us, on the theory that a geologist's habits might actually be useful for something other than annoying me. We got moving again with that plan in mind, angling now for higher, more visible ground rather than the most direct route. My father's pace slower than ever, but his focus sharper, both of us scanning the ridgeline above the wilderness area for any moving vehicle we could throw a flash of reflected sun at, which is exactly what, a little over an hour later, saved us. The flash caught a National Park Service truck working the rim road on its own post-storm check, and I watched it slow, then stop, then start working its way to pull off closer to our position. And I have never in my life felt relief arrive so physically, like something actually loosening in my chest rather than just a thought about feeling better. The ranger who reached us on foot, high clearance vehicle left where the terrain still wouldn't allow it closer, took one look at my father's leg and got on the radio immediately, calling in coordinates and a request for medical transport rather than asking us to explain ourselves first, which told me plenty about how the leg actually looked to someone seeing it fresh rather than someone who'd been staring at it for 12 hours. It took another hour and a half to get my father out to a point a ground ambulance could actually reach, most of it spent on a park utility vehicle picking its way along a route that still wasn't fully dry, and by the time we reached pavement his color had gone from gray to something closer to normal, though the leg, a tibial plateau fracture, we'd learned at the hospital in Rapid City, was not something a night's rest was going to fix. He went into surgery 2 days later, plates and screws, a recovery timeline measured in months rather than weeks. And I spent those 2 days in a waiting room going over the storm in my head in a loop that didn't get more useful with repetition, landing every time on the same unhelpful thought that I'd flagged the wash bottom camp once, let it go once, and that a version of that night existed where I'd pushed harder and none of this happened. He healed, mostly. The knee doesn't fully straighten anymore, and he's traded his easy retired man's hiking for shorter walks with a cane he pretends to need less than he does. And neither of us has said much out loud about the specific 20 minutes between the wash rising and us reaching the van, though I notice him checking weather radar now with a focus he never used to bother with, which is its own kind of unspoken apology I've decided not to push him on. My dissertation samples from that trip sat untouched in my lab for the better part of a year, technically fine, technically usable, and I kept finding reasons not to open the cases, until my advisor finally asked me directly why I was avoiding perfectly good data, and I didn't have an answer that sounded like anything other than what it was. I went back out to Sage Creek the following spring, alone this time, in dry, easy weather, mostly to see if I could stand in that wash bottom without my chest doing the thing it still does, and found the flood had cut the bank back nearly 4 feet deeper than it had been, exposing a fresh, pale cross-section of clay that hadn't seen daylight in tens of thousands of years. Embedded in that fresh cut, at about knee height, was a curve of bone pale, as the surrounding rock, too large and too specifically shaped to be anything recent, the kind of find that would normally have me radioing my advisor before I'd finished photographing it properly. And I stood there long while looking at it, at the whole raw exposed face of the wash the water had carved open in one night, thinking about everything that gets buried out here, and how little say any of us actually have in. When the ground decides to give it back, I didn't report it. I photographed it, noted the coordinates in a notebook I haven't shown anyone, and covered it back over with a few handfuls of loose clay before I left, which isn't good field practice and isn't something I can fully explain, except that some things I've decided the wash can keep a little longer. My name is Sloan Aberdeen. I am 38 years old. I spent 11 years as a medical transcriptionist before I figured out I could do the same work from anywhere with a laptop and a decent signal, sold most of what I owned, and built out a van well enough to call a home instead of an experiment. 6 months in, I still hadn't gotten tired of my own company, which is either the healthiest thing about me or the thing everyone who knew me before would find hardest to believe. I don't travel with anyone, by choice, and I'd gotten comfortable enough with long solo stretches that a week without a real conversation didn't register as strange anymore, just as Tuesday. I keep a journal less for sentiment and more for structure, dates, weather, work hours, small notes on where I parked and why. A habit left over from a job that trained me to document everything precisely, which turned out to be a useful habit to bring into a life with a lot fewer external structures holding the days in place. I've been working my way through the Black Hills for a couple weeks when I found Spearfish Canyon, and specifically a Forest Service spur off the main byway that climbed away from the waterfalls and the tourist pull-offs toward the site of an old mining town called Maurice. Gone by the early 1900s, nothing left now but scattered foundation stones and tailings grown over with grass. The kind of place that shows up as a small dot on historical maps and nothing at all on the tourist ones. The spur had just enough cell signal for my work calls, which is a rarer combination out here than people assume, and enough seclusion that I hadn't seen another vehicle in the 2 days since I'd found it. I parked in a flat clearing, maybe a quarter mile past the last visible foundation, close enough to the creek to hear it working over rock all night, far enough from the byway that the road noise disappeared entirely once the sun went down. I liked it immediately, the specific quiet of a canyon that funnels sound strangely. The walls throw echoes back at odd angles, so a bird call from 100 yards off can sound like it's right outside your window, which I found charming rather than unsettling on that first evening, sitting outside with my laptop finishing a transcription while the light went gold and then gray on the canyon walls above me. I decided, somewhere in that first evening, to stay several days instead of the usual 1 or 2. Good signal, good scenery, nobody around to negotiate space with, exactly the kind of stretch I'd built this whole life to make room for. I made dinner, did an hour of journaling by headlamp, noted the date and the spot, and a line about the quiet being the good kind, and went to sleep with the van door cracked for airflow the way I always do when I feel safe somewhere. The second morning started ordinary. Coffee, an early work call, a walk down to look at the Maurice foundations properly while my laptop charged off the solar panel. There's something specific about standing in the outline of a building that isn't there anymore, just a rectangle of stacked stone in the grass, that makes a place feel inhabited even when it plainly isn't. I spent longer down there than I meant to, then came back up to camp and found my folding chair had moved. Not far, maybe 6 feet from where I'd set it, facing the creek to a spot closer to the van, angled toward my tent instead. I stood there running through the obvious explanations. Wind, though it hadn't been strong enough overnight to move a weighted chair that distance. My own forgetfulness, though I was fairly confident of where I'd left it. I wrote it down in the journal anyway, the way I write everything down, mostly because the habit doesn't know how to distinguish between important and unimportant yet. I told myself, setting the chair back and finishing my coffee, that 6 months alone on the road is exactly the kind of stretch that makes a person start noticing things that were always there and never mattered before. A gust of wind, an afternoon of distraction, ordinary gaps in memory that only look strange if you decide in advance to be suspicious of them. I believe that theory completely on day 2. I want that on record, because it didn't hold up nearly as well by day 4. Day 3 started with a work call that ran long, which put me down at the Maurice foundations later in the afternoon than usual, the light already starting to slant low through the canyon by the time I got there. I was photographing one of the better preserved stone footings for no reason beyond liking the texture when I noticed marks scratched into the stone at the base. Not old, not weathered the way everything else there was, a small cluster of tally marks, 5 sets of 5, and beneath them, barely legible, what might have been a date from earlier that same year. I told myself plenty of people probably passed through here, hikers, history buffs, kids from Spearfish with nothing better to do. And tally marks on an old foundation stone didn't have to mean anything specific about me or my camp a quarter mile up the spur. I photographed it anyway and noted in the journal, the entry getting longer and more detailed than my usual notes, which I noticed myself doing and didn't stop doing. That night the canyon's acoustics did something I hadn't experienced the first 2 evenings, a low, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again, cycling for what my journal later confirmed was close to 20 minutes before it stopped. I told myself it was a branch against rock, water moving something loose downstream, the kind of sound canyon walls are known for bending and throwing in directions that don't match their source. I believed maybe 60% of that explanation, which was down from the 100% I'd have believed on day 2. I slept badly, waking twice to total silence that felt somehow louder than the tapping had, and got up on day 4 more tired than I should have been for someone who hadn't done anything more strenuous than sit at a laptop and walk to some old foundation stones. I made coffee, checked my gear out of habit, and realized my multi-tool wasn't in the door pocket where it lives permanently. Hasn't moved from in 6 months of daily use. I searched the van properly, which took 20 minutes and turned up nothing, and then searched the ground around camp on the theory that I'd dropped it at some point without noticing, which also turned up nothing. I wrote the entry with a level of specificity that, rereading it days later, sounds like someone building a case rather than someone keeping a diary. Exact last seen time, exact search radius, a note that the door pocket zipper was closed the way I always leave it, which meant if it fell out, someone had to have opened that pocket first. I had a work call that afternoon that I got through on autopilot, half my attention on the tree lean across the creek, and somewhere in the middle of it I caught, at the very edge of my vision, a shape among the pines on the far bank. Upright, still, gone the instant I turned my head fully toward it. Nothing there but ordinary trunks and ordinary shadow when I actually looked. I told myself it was exactly what peripheral vision does to still shapes in dappled light. I've told myself a lot of things this week that didn't hold up. I checked my side mirror later that evening walking back from the creek with water for dishes, an old habit from city driving that doesn't have much use out here, and caught, for less than a second shape reflected in it standing behind me that wasn't there when I spun around. Nothing behind me, but the empty clearing and the van's own shadow stretching long in the last light. I sat in the van that night with the door locked for the first time since I'd started this life, journal open on my lap, trying to write down what had actually happened rather than what my nerves were insisting had happened, and found I couldn't fully separate the two anymore, which was its own kind of unsettling, entirely apart from whatever was or wasn't actually out there past the trailing. Day 5, I decided, was going to be my last day at Maurice regardless of how good the signal was. A decision I made with the specific, deliberate calm of someone trying to convince herself she wasn't scared, just ready to move on. I finished my morning work call, packed up methodically, and turned the key expecting the ordinary sound of the engine catching. I got nothing. Not even a weak turnover, just a single dull click in silence. I've done enough of my own basic maintenance over 6 months to check the obvious things: battery connections, fuses, the terminals I keep meaning to clean and never do, and everything looked exactly the way it should. No corrosion, no loose cable, nothing that explained a dead click where an engine should be. I sat behind a wheel for a long minute, working through whether this was ordinary bad luck on an aging vehicle or something else, and made myself stop that second line of thinking before it went anywhere useful. I had enough signal to call a mobile mechanic service out of Spearfish, and got a voicemail promising a call back within the hour, which meant I had at minimum an hour, possibly most of a day, sitting still at campsite. I'd already decided to leave. I moved my folding chair to where I could see both the spur road and the tree lean across the creek at the same time, and sat there with my phone in one hand and, for the first time in 6 months on the road, the small fixed blade knife I keep for camp chores in the other. The mechanic called back around noon, described a possible starter or solenoid issue based on what I told him, and said he could get out to me by early evening, weather and his schedule allowing, which left me with several more hours of daylight and a campsite I no longer wanted to be sitting in. I spent most of it doing something I've never done before out here, which was pace, short loops around the van, checking the tree lean, checking the spur, unable to settle into work or reading or anything that required looking at a screen instead of my surroundings. Around 3, walking the perimeter of camp for what must have been the 10th time, I found something that ended whatever percentage of doubt I've been holding on to. My missing multi-tool, laid neatly on the flat foundation stone nearest camp, blade open, positioned dead center like it had been placed there specifically to be found by someone walking exactly the loop I was walking. I didn't touch it. I photographed it from several angles with hands that weren't fully steady, backed away, and got into the van, locking the doors on a vehicle that couldn't start and wasn't going anywhere, which felt less like safety and more like choosing a smaller box to wait in. I texted the mechanic asking him to hurry, with no way to know if the message had actually gone out on the thin signal I still had. The hours between 3 and the mechanic's eventual arrival a little after 6 are the worst documented stretch in my journal. A handful of short, clipped entries instead of my usual detail, because I spent most of that time simply watching. The tree lean, the spur, the multi-tool still sitting exactly where I'd found it, because I couldn't make myself go back out and retrieve it. Nothing crossed the clearing in those 3 hours that I could point to directly. No clear shape. No sound I could swear to beyond the canyon's usual acoustic tricks. And by the time headlights finally swung up the spur road, I was in a state somewhere past fear and into a kind of flat, exhausted alertness that made the arrival of an actual human stranger feel almost as disorienting as everything that had come before it. The mechanic, a heavy-set guy in his 50s named Purcell who didn't ask why I looked the way I looked, found a corroded ground strap behind the engine block within about 15 minutes. A straightforward, boring explanation for the dead click, the kind of thing that happens on any vehicle this age regardless of anything else going on around it. I wanted to feel relieved by how mundane it was. I mostly felt like the explanation didn't account for everything else, and I said as much, more than I meant to, standing there in the fading light. Purcell's face did something careful when I mentioned the chair, the marks on the foundation stone, the multi-tool laid out deliberately on flat rock. Not disbelief exactly, more the expression of a guy who spent a lot of time in remote country and has heard some version of this story before. He said, working the strap loose to clean and reseat it, that the old mining sites out here draw a certain kind of person who doesn't love company, and that he'd tow me out himself if I wanted, no charge for the extra trouble, rather than leave me to test the starter alone after dark. I asked him, more directly than I meant to, whether he'd heard of anything like this happening at Maurice specifically, and he took long enough answering that I understood the pause itself was an answer of sorts. Said there'd been talk over the years, nothing official, the kind of thing that gets repeated at the gas station and never written down anywhere a person could point to. He didn't elaborate past that. I didn't push, mostly because I wasn't sure I wanted the specifics badly enough to hear them standing in that clearing after dark. I said yes to the tow before he'd finished the offer. He got the van running clean within another 20 minutes, and I followed his truck's taillights out the spur road with my headlights, doing something I wasn't proud of, sweeping the tree line every few seconds instead of watching the road the way I should have been, my hands locked hard enough on the wheel that they ached by the time we hit the paved byway. The drive down through the canyon in the dark should have felt like relief, and mostly did, though I kept checking my mirrors on straightaways for headlights that weren't Purcell's, an old habit resurrected from a very different kind of fear than the one that had actually gotten me into this. The waterfalls we passed lit briefly by our headlights looked exactly as pretty as they had on the way in, which felt like an odd thing to notice and an odder thing to be grateful for. Purcell led me all the way to a developed campground near Savoy with actual other people in it, actual lit sites, generators humming, a family 2 spots over still awake and laughing about something at their picnic table, and he waited until I checked in and parked before he left, which I understood as a kindness I hadn't asked for and badly needed anyway. I sat outside the van for a while after he pulled out, just listening to how different ordinary human noise sounded after 5 days without much of it. Someone's radio low in the distance, a kid arguing about whose turn it was to feed the campfire, the particular comfort of not being the only heat signature for a quarter mile in any direction. I went to bed early and slept for the first time in 3 nights, without waking to check the door, without running the canyon's tapping sound back through my head, trying to reassign it to something explainable. I woke once around 3 from habit rather than fear, heard the generator 2 sites over still humming its ordinary hum, and went right back to sleep, which told me plenty about how much of the last few days had actually been about the isolation itself, and not just whatever had or hadn't been sharing it with me. I decided over coffee the next morning, watching that same family packing up their ordinary crowded campsite, that whatever this had been, it deserved to be on record somewhere official rather than just in my own journal, and drove into Spearfish that afternoon to make it so. I called the multi-tool into the county sheriff's non-emergency line, more out of a sense that it should be documented than any real hope it would lead anywhere, and gave a statement in person to a deputy who wrote it all down with a patience that made me suspect he'd taken reports like this before. He told me, not unkindly, that they'd had scattered reports over the years of someone, or several someones over time, squatting around the old town site, transient and hard to track, never anything they'd been able to make an arrest on. He asked good questions, the kind that made me realize how much of what I'd experienced didn't actually translate well into a formal statement. A chair moved 6 feet, a sound the canyon walls could plausibly have bent from somewhere ordinary, a tool that turned up placed rather than simply lost. I watched him write it all down anyway, professionally, without the skepticism I half expected, and understood by the end that this was going into a file that would sit next to other files just like it, unresolved for the same structural reasons mine probably would be. A patrol went out to Maurice 2 days later at my request, more curiosity than expectation on my part by then. They found an old sleeping bag and a scatter of food wrappers tucked into a hollow beneath one of the larger foundation stones, weathered enough to have been there a while, no other physical evidence. Nothing that confirmed or denied anything I'd actually experienced up there in any way a report could usefully capture. I called my sister that night, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone who'd known me before any of this, and she listened all the way through without interrupting, then asked, gently, whether I'd been sleeping enough out there, eating enough, talking to anyone in the stretches between towns. It was a fair question. It was also not one I had a comfortable answer to, and I noticed myself getting defensive in a way that told me she'd landed closer to something true than I wanted her to. I've gone back over my journal from those 5 days more times than I want to admit, looking for the exact point where ordinary solitude tipped into something else, and I can't find it. Every individual entry reads on its own like something explainable: a chair moved by wind, a sound bent by canyon walls, a tool I misplaced and later found. It's only reading the whole run together that the shape of something else starts to show through, and even then I can't tell you with certainty whether that shape was ever actually out there, or whether 5 days alone built it entirely out of my own attention, turned back on itself. Both explanations sit in my head now at the same time, permanently, neither one winning out completely. The version where someone real was watching a woman camped alone and decided to see how far he could push that without showing his face, and the version where nobody was ever there at all, and I did all of it to myself with nothing but silence and a well-trained habit of paying close attention to small details. I still travel alone. I haven't stopped, and I don't plan to, but I don't pick spurs with no other vehicles on them anymore. Not the way I used to seek those exact spots out on purpose. And I keep the van door shut and locked most nights now, regardless of the airflow I'm giving up for it. I've started building in something I never used to bother with: a call or a text to my sister every couple of days. No real content to most of them, just proof of an outside voice checking in on the days between towns, which she never mentions as new and I never explain as necessary. Every so often, park somewhere new and quiet, I'll catch myself counting days since I've seen another person, days since I last checked the tree line for no particular reason, days since I stopped being sure whether the thing that changed up at Maurice was something that found me, or something in me that finally had enough silence around it to be heard. My name is Noel Kirchner. I am 26 years old. I spend my summers doing interpretive guiding at state parks, which mostly means I know an unreasonable number of facts about prairie ecosystems and glacial geology that I'm always looking for an excuse to use on someone. I've been seeing Dashiell Reyes for about 4 months when his surveying contract took him out to Clay County, and when he asked if I wanted to ride along and turn it into a real trip, I said yes faster than probably any decision I made about him up to that point. Dashiell is 33, a land surveyor for a firm out of Sioux Falls, methodical in a way that shows up in everything he does. The way he packs a cooler, the way he double-checks a campsite before committing to it, the way he'll reshoot a property line 3 times rather than trust a first reading he's not fully confident in. It's a good trait in a surveyor and, for months in, still a mostly charming one in a boyfriend, though I suspected there'd come a point on this trip where his caution and my curiosity were going to disagree about something. His job had him marking boundary points near Vermilion for most of the week, which left afternoons and evenings free, and I'd been angling since day one to get us out to Spirit Mound, a low-rise of prairie a few miles outside town that I've been fascinated by since a college course touched on it. One of the very few landforms in the whole Lewis and Clark expedition record that the explorers went out of their way to visit specifically because of the stories the Yankton won Dakota and neighboring nations told about it. Stories of small, powerful beings said to guard the place and deal harshly with anyone who came too close. The mound itself, when we finally got out there on our 3rd evening, undercut every expectation I'd built around it. Barely visible as a landform at all from a distance, just a gentle swell in an otherwise dead-flat expanse of restored tall grass prairie, the kind of subtle rise you drive past without noticing if you didn't already know to look for it. The historic site closes at dusk, gate locked, small visitor lot empty by the time we arrived, and we parked an illegal pull-off along the access road instead, close enough to walk the boundary fence at first light. Dashiell, professionally curious about elevation data, even off the clock, pulled a handheld GPS unit from his gear and started idly checking readings against the county survey markers he'd been working with all week, more habit than necessity. I watched the sun go down over that huge flat prairie horizon, the mound itself barely a shadow against the last light, and felt the specific, pleasant unease of standing somewhere that had clearly mattered to people for a very long time before either of us showed up with a GPS unit and a curiosity we hadn't fully earned yet. We made camp for the night in the pull-off, not officially on the historic site itself, technically within the letter of the rules if not entirely their spirit, and I noticed Dashiell checking the fence line twice before settling in, a small tell I filed away without comment. Dinner was simple, the conversation easy, both of us still riding the good version of early relationship momentum, where even an evening park next to a fenced-off prairie mound felt more romantic than strange. Full dark out there, arrived, total and enormous. No ambient light for miles in any direction. Stars crowding in thick enough that Dashiell abandoned his GPS unit for a while, just to lie back against the van and point out constellations he half remembered from a childhood telescope. I remember that stretch as the best part of the whole trip. Genuinely, before anything had started, two people flat on their backs under more sky than either of us usually got to see. Somewhere around 10, walking a short distance from camp to find better signal for a work text Dashiell needed to send, I caught a small light on the mount itself. Low, pale, and moving in a way that didn't track with any explanation I had ready, gone by the time I'd covered enough ground to get Dashiell's attention and point him at it. He said it was probably a reflection, a car on a distant road, something ordinary bent strange by distance and dark. I want to believe that. I mostly did that first night. Neither of us slept especially well, though neither of us said so directly, both a little too aware of how flat and open the surrounding prairie was, how far sound carried across it, how completely visible our one small camp must have been to anything or anyone out there with a clear line of sight and nothing between us but grass. Dashiell's GPS unit was doing something wrong by the second morning, drifting readings by several feet between checks taken only minutes apart from the exact same spot, a margin of error he described, with visible professional annoyance, as well outside anything he'd expect from a unit that had performed perfectly all week on every other job site. He blamed atmospheric interference, a bad battery, anything with a rational shape to it, and spent a frustrated hour recalibrating against a known survey marker before giving up and switching to an older backup unit instead. We walked the fence line properly that morning, staying on the legal side of it, and I gave Dashiell the fuller version of the history I'd been sitting on, how the expedition's own journals describe a landform local nations wouldn't approach, out of respect and genuine caution both, how successive travelers noted an odd absence of animal life around the mound compared to the surrounding prairie. A detail modern park literature still mentions almost in passing, like nobody's fully comfortable explaining it, and nobody wants to leave it out either. Dashiell listened with the specific attention he gives anything that resembles a data set, and offered his own read. That isolated landforms on featureless terrain often develop reputations precisely because they're the one thing a traveler's eye catches, the one landmark worth building a story around. Nothing supernatural required. It was a reasonable theory. I noticed he checked his backup GPS twice more while making the argument, which undercut the confidence of the delivery a little. By afternoon, the drift on the backup unit had started too, smaller than the first one, but present. Readings that put our stationary camp several yards from where it demonstrably sat, correcting themselves, and drifting again in a pattern Dashiell couldn't attribute to anything in his professional experience, which I could tell bothered him considerably more than he was willing to say outright. I started feeling it myself sometime after lunch, a low, persistent headache and a faint dizziness that came and went in waves. Nothing dramatic, nothing I'd have thought twice about anywhere else, except it seemed to sharpen the closer we walked to the boundary fence, and ease noticeably the farther we got from it. A correlation I tested twice, deliberately, before saying anything to Dashiell about it. He took the symptom more seriously than the GPS drift, professional skepticism giving briefly to boyfriend concern, checking me for signs of heat exhaustion or dehydration, both of which I could rule out easily enough given how much water I'd been drinking and how mild the day actually was. Neither of us had a good explanation. We didn't manufacture one either, and just noted it, the way you note something you plan to bring up again later if it doesn't resolve on its own. We saw them, or saw something, a little before dusk, small shapes moving low through the tall grass, maybe 200 yards out, upright but well under adult human height, gone into the grass whenever we try to fix them with a direct look, present again the moment our attention drifted elsewhere. Dashiell's first read was deer, then dogs, then, with visibly decreasing conviction each time, nothing at all, just grass moving in wind that wasn't actually blowing hard enough to explain it. I didn't argue with any of his explanations out loud. I also didn't stop watching that stretch of grass for the rest of the evening, and neither, I noticed, did he, both of us keeping half an eye on it through dinner in a way neither of us acknowledged directly, the easy romantic mood of the first night thinning out into something more careful, more alert. We went to bed that second night with the van doors locked, windows up despite the heat. Both of us lying still longer than either of us was actually asleep, listening to a prairie that should have been full of ordinary night sound. Insects, wind through grass, the occasional distant vehicle, and instead felt, for stretches at a time, unnervingly, completely silent. I woke sometime after 2 with Dashiell already sitting up beside me, his backup GPS unit lit in his hand, staring at a reading he wouldn't explain until I'd fully surfaced from sleep. Our position, according to the unit, placed us nearly 300 yards from the pull-off, out toward the mount itself, a shift no amount of drift or interference should have been able to produce for a stationary vehicle overnight. We checked it against the physical world immediately, looking out both windows at landmarks we'd memorized specifically for this purpose. A fence post, a stand of taller grass, the angle of the access road, and everything matched exactly where we'd parked. No actual movement, which left us with a GPS unit insisting on a location that didn't match anything we could verify with our own eyes. A discrepancy neither of us had a framework for. Dashiell, working hard to keep his voice level, floated the idea that maybe both units had failed identically due to some local magnetic anomaly. Iron content in the soil, something with a plausible physical basis he could hold on to, and I let him have the theory because I didn't have anything better, and because the alternative sitting underneath it, unspoken, was worse than either of us wanted to say out loud at 2 in the morning. I heard it before I saw anything. A thin, high sound from somewhere out past the fence line. Not quite a voice, and not quite anything else I could categorize. Brief, gone almost as soon as I'd registered it, and Dashiell's hand found mine in the dark hard enough that I understood he'd heard it too, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise this time. We sat like that for a long stretch, neither of us willing to look outside again, and neither of us willing to say we should just start the van and leave, some combination of stubbornness and disbelief keeping us rooted in place until the gray edge of dawn finally started softening the windows, at which point the decision to stay suddenly felt like the only sane one we'd made all night. Daylight doing what daylight always does to a fear that only fully makes sense in the dark. Morning brought normal sound back. Birds, insects, and actual breeze moving actual grass. And both GPS units, checked fresh, gave readings that matched our real position within a few feet, well inside normal tolerance, as if whatever had been interfering with them overnight had simply stopped being interested. Dashiell ran the numbers twice, visibly needing the confirmation more than I did. We should have left that morning. I want that on the record, the way Dashiell later insisted on saying it to the ranger who eventually took her statement. That we knew, by daylight of the third day, that something about the mound didn't track with any explanation either of us had. And we stayed anyway, because his contract had 2 more days on it, and because some combination of curiosity and stubborn pride convinced us we could finish the trip on our own terms. I walked the boundary fence alone that afternoon, while Dashiell finished his last survey points in town, close enough to see the mound clearly in full daylight for the first time. A modest grassy rise, nothing more, entirely unremarkable to look at, and I stood there alone while trying to reconcile that ordinary appearance with everything the last 2 nights had put in front of us, unable to make the two things sit comfortably together. I was maybe 40 yards from the van on my walk back when the headache hit harder than it had all trip, sudden and disorienting enough that I had to stop and put a hand against a fence post, and for a stretch of time, I still can't account for precisely, long enough that the light had shifted noticeably when I came back to myself. I found I'd somehow walked 20 yards in the wrong direction, toward the mound rather than away from it, with no clear memory of turning around at all. I didn't tell Dashiell about the missing stretch of time right away, mostly because I didn't have language for it that didn't sound worse than I wanted it to sound, and spent the drive back to camp turning it over privately, trying to build an ordinary explanation: low blood sugar, disorientation from the headache, simple carelessness about which direction I'd been facing. None of the explanations fit as cleanly as I wanted them to. I told him that night, instead, once we were both back at camp with the doors locked and the last of the daylight gone, and watched his face do the thing it had been doing more and more over the last 2 days. Methodical caution losing ground steadily to something he wasn't equipped to file under any category he trusted. He didn't offer a rational theory this time. He just asked, quietly, if I was okay now, and held onto my hand longer than the question strictly required. We agreed, finally, fully, that we were leaving first thing in the morning regardless of the unfinished survey points, and that agreement should have been the end of the tension for the night. Instead, close to midnight, Dashiell's backup GPS lit up on its own from the dash where he'd left it, screen active without either of us touching it, displaying the same 300-yard offset toward the mound that it had shown 2 nights before, though we were this time, both of us wide awake to watch it happen in real time. He grabbed the unit and powered it off manually, hands not quite steady, and we sat in a dark that felt considerably less empty than it had the first 2 nights, both of us now fully past the point of manufacturing comfortable explanations for anything. I heard the thin, high sound again, closer this time, close enough that it seemed to come from just the other side of the van door rather than somewhere out past the fence. Dashiell wanted to start the engine immediately and drive, regardless of the hour, regardless of how well either of us could actually navigate that access road in full dark. And I found myself, for the first time all trip, arguing for staying still instead, some instinct telling me that movement, right then, in that dark, felt more dangerous than sitting quietly and waiting for whatever this was to lose interest the way it seemingly had before. We compromised on neither, which is to say we sat frozen, unable to fully commit to either plan, for what my phone's clock later confirmed was nearly 40 minutes, listening to sounds that came and went at the edge of hearing, small shifts in the grass outside that could have been wind and mostly, by that point, didn't sound like wind to either of us. The GPS lit itself again a little after 1, and this time neither of us watched the screen. Dashiell simply reached over without looking, pulled the battery entirely, and set both the dead unit and the loose battery on the dashboard like that physical separation meant something, which, given everything else we didn't understand that night, felt like as reasonable a response as any other available to us. We didn't sleep again after that, just sat upright together through the last hours of dark, watching the windows, waiting out a night that felt considerably longer than the math of it should have allowed, until the gray of approaching dawn finally started softening the glass and some of the pressure in the air. I don't have a better word for it. Noticeably eased. We left at first light without finishing breakfast, without Dashiell circling back for his last 2 survey points, driving the access road out with both GPS units left dismantled on the dash, and neither of us saying much until Vermilion's actual streetlights came into view, at which point I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't fully registered clenching in the first place. Dashiell called his supervisor from a gas station on the edge of town, said he'd finished the remaining points from a different approach angle later in the week, and didn't offer any explanation beyond equipment trouble, which was true in the narrowest possible sense, and left out everything that actually mattered about the last 3 days. We talked to a ranger at the visitor center that same morning, more because I needed to say it out loud to someone with actual knowledge of the site than any real hope of an official response, and she listened without the skepticism I braced for, said the site had a long documented history of visitors reporting exactly this kind of thing: equipment malfunction, missing time, a persistent sense of being watched, going back long before GPS units existed to malfunction on anyone. She didn't offer a supernatural explanation any more than she offered a dismissive one, just handed me a small photocopied handout on the site's documented history and said, gently, that plenty of people came away from Spirit Mound with a story they couldn't fully explain and mostly learned to live alongside it rather than resolve it, which wasn't the comfort I'd been hoping for and turned out to be the closest thing to comfort actually available. I've thought a great deal since about that stretch of missing time on the fence line, the 20 yards I apparently walked with no memory of the turn, the headache that lifted the moment I was moving away from the mound rather than toward it, and I've never landed on an explanation that fully satisfies the nurse-precise part of my brain that wants clean documentation for everything. I've had to make my peace with an incomplete file, which is not a thing my personality does easily. Dashiell finished his survey job a week later, from a different access point on the far side of the property, and told me afterward that his equipment behaved perfectly the entire time. No drift, no unexplained battery drain, nothing, which he offered up almost apologetically, like the absence of a repeat incident was somehow its own kind of evidence, for or against something neither of us had settled on believing. We're still together, 5 months on from that trip now, and it's changed the shape of us in a way I don't think either of us expected a single camping trip to manage. Quicker to leave a place that feels wrong rather than talk ourselves out of the feeling, quicker to believe each other's account of something strange rather than reach for the tittiest available explanation first. I still keep that photocopied handout from the Ranger folded in my glove box. Edge has gone soft from being handled more than a piece of paper about a grassy rise in Clay County has any obvious reason to be handled. And I take it out sometimes on long drives, not for any information it actually contains, but because holding it is the closest thing I have to proof that any of it happened at all. Every so often, unprompted, usually somewhere with a long flat horizon that reminds me of that prairie, I'll catch myself checking a compass app on my phone against a landmark I already know the position of, just to be sure it still agrees with me, and I've stopped being embarrassed about needing to check. My name is Foster Ainsley. I am 41 years old. I spent 14 years as a detective with the Minneapolis Police Department before I burned out hard enough to quit outright, sell the condo, and buy a used van with money I probably should have put toward therapy instead. Old habits don't leave with the badge, though. I still rent a room, or a campsite, or a stranger's face, the same way I did on the job. And I've had to learn, slowly, that not every red needs acting on. My nephew Milo Castellanos is 29, my sister's kid, a guy who spent most of his 20s bouncing between gig jobs and half-finished community college credits without much of a plan, which used to worry me more than it does now. He asked to come along on this trip mostly, I think, to get a look at what I was doing with my life since the divorce and the resignation both landed the same year. And I said yes because spending real time with him felt like the first genuinely good idea I'd had in a while. We'd been working our way east across South Dakota, and I'd specifically routed us toward Palisades State Park outside Garrettson, a spot I remembered from an old case file years back. Nothing to do with the park itself, just a name that stuck. Pink quartzite cliffs cut through by Split Rock Creek, and nearby, a legendary gorge called Devil's Gulch, where local lore has Jesse James clearing a 20-foot jump on horseback to outrun a posse back in 1876. Milo, predictably, thought that story was the coolest thing he'd heard all trip. We got a legal site inside the developed campground the first night, close enough to the cliffs to hear the creek working through the quartzite all night, and spent the next morning doing the tourist things. The footbridge over the gulch, photos at the overlook, Milo doing an enthusiastic and badly researched reenactment of the jump that made me laugh harder than I had in months. It was up to about 2 in the afternoon, exactly the uncomplicated trip I'd wanted us to have. We decided, after lunch, to hike a stretch of undeveloped land along Split Rock Creek outside the official park boundary, an old habit of mine from the job. I've never fully trusted the version of a place that's been mowed and signed for tourists, and some part of me still wants to see the version underneath it. Milo was game, mostly because I was the one with the map, and he'd have followed me into worse ideas that week without much argument. Maybe a mile downstream of the boundary fence, the creek bank widened into a flat clearing tucked behind a low quartzite outcrop, and I clocked the wrongness of it before Milo did, the specific kind of wrongness that used to precede a lot of my better callers. A vehicle pulled well back in a brush that hadn't grown there naturally, branches cut and repositioned rather than simply overgrown, tire ruts leading to a spot that made no logical sense for anyone legitimately using this land. I told Milo to hang back and stay quiet, in the flat, unarguable tone I used to use on rookies, and he actually listened, which told me he'd picked up on something in my face that I hadn't fully articulated to myself yet. I moved closer to the clearing alone, staying low against the outcrop, and got close enough to make out a second vehicle beyond the first. A battered pickup with plates I made a point of memorizing out of an instinct I hadn't used professionally in 3 years. There was a structure back there too, something between a shed and a lean-to, patched together from scrap lumber and a salvage camper shell, deliberately positioned to be invisible from the water and from any reasonable hiking route. The kind of setup I'd seen exactly twice before in my career, both times attached to something I'd rather not have found alone, and both times exactly this far off any path a normal person would take. I was still working out whether to pull back quietly and call in from somewhere with signal, or push a little closer to confirm what my gut was already telling me, when a voice, young, male, sharp with a fear that had nothing performative about it, came from inside that shed, saying please, just loud enough to carry across the clearing, and every instinct I'd spent 3 years trying to retire came roaring back online at once. I got back to Milo faster and quieter than I'd moved in years, pulled him another 50 yards upstream behind the outcrop, and laid it out for him in the shortest possible version. A structure, 2 vehicles, a voice that didn't belong to anyone having a good afternoon. You want to go back with me and look? I told him no in the same flat tone from before, and this time it took him a beat longer to actually agree, which I understood as the first sign of the trip that his instincts and mine were going to pull in different directions before this was over. We had no signal at all on the creek bank, predictably, which meant the closest realistic option was hiking back the mile to the developed campground and finding a landline or a ranger with a radio, a plan I liked and hated in roughly equal measure, because it meant walking away from a voice that had said please and not knowing, for at least 20 minutes, what happened to whoever it belonged to in the meantime. We started back at a pace faster than a casual hike, both of us glancing over our shoulders more than either of us needed to on flat, empty trail, and made it maybe halfway before Milo, working something over in his head the whole walk, stopped and said flatly that he wasn't okay leaving without at least trying to see who was in there, that we might be the only people who even knew this shed existed, and that a mile round trip for help could be a mile too long for whoever we'd just heard. I understood the instinct. I'd built a 14-year career on some version of that same instinct. I also understood, in a way Milo at 29 hadn't had the chance to learn yet, exactly how badly civilians get hurt improvising around armed criminals without backup, radios, or a plan beyond good intentions. And I told him so, more sharply than I meant to, which didn't land the way I wanted it to. We compromised on something I'm still not sure was the right call. I go back alone, close enough to get eyes on the shed and confirm whether there was actually a person in immediate danger worth the delay of a full-mile hike for help, while Milo continued on toward the campground to start that process regardless of what I found. So that help was moving either way. I made it back to the outcrop in under 10 minutes, moving the way the job had trained me to move through unfamiliar terrain toward an unknown threat, and got close enough this time to see actual movement. A man, mid-30s maybe, stepping out of the shed with a length of rope in one hand, checking something in his waistband with the other in a gesture I recognized instantly and professionally as someone confirming a firearm was still where he expected it. I backed off before he had any chance of clocking me, moving slower now, more careful, working the geometry of the clearing in my head the way I used to work a scene. One confirmed subject, one confirmed voice from inside the structure, two vehicles suggesting at least the possibility of a second person I hadn't seen yet, no visible restraint on the man outside, meaning he wasn't restrained, which told me plenty about which side of this he was on. I was working my way back toward the trail when a second voice reached me, older, rougher, coming from somewhere near the pickup truck rather than the shed, and the two voices exchanged a handful of words I couldn't make out clearly enough to be useful, except for a tone in both of them that had shifted in the last few minutes from routine to alert, which meant either they heard something or my read on their schedule was worse than I'd assumed. I didn't wait to find out which. I moved fast and low back toward the trail Milo and I coming on, working out of my head, with the specific dread of a man who used to have backup and radios and a badge that made people cooperate. Exactly how thin our actual position was: 2 civilians, no service, an unknown number of armed men, and a voice from inside a shed that I now had to assume was in more danger than it had been 10 minutes earlier, because of us. I caught up to Milo about a quarter-mile short of the developed campground boundary, both of us moving fast now, and told him what I'd seen in as few words as the urgency allowed. Armed, at least 2 men, and a shift in their behavior right before I pulled out that I couldn't be sure wasn't connected to us. He didn't argue this time. Whatever certainty had been driving him earlier had visibly cracked somewhere in the last 15 minutes, replaced by the same flat fear I remembered from my first genuinely bad night on patrol. We hit the campground, and I went straight for the camp host site, a retired couple who'd been friendly at check-in the day before, and asked, with a calm I didn't remotely feel, whether they had a landline or a working radio, because we needed to reach the sheriff's office about a possible kidnapping situation on land adjacent to the park. The host, to his credit, didn't waste time on disbelief, just handed over a cell phone with actual signal and told us his own hand was shaking too much to be useful dialing it himself. I gave the dispatcher everything I had in the clipped, structured format 14 years of the job had beaten into permanent muscle memory. Location, description of the structure, the vehicle and plate I'd memorized, 2 confirmed male voices, at least one apparent captive, and the dispatcher's tone shifted audibly once she registered I wasn't a panic tourist, but someone who knew exactly how to be useful on a call like this. Units were rolling, she said. 15, maybe 20 minutes out given the road. 20 minutes felt like an unbearable length of time, standing in a campground parking lot doing nothing. And I could see the same math working itself out on Milo's face. Both of us replaying that please from the shed on a loop neither of us could turn off. He asked, quietly, if we should go back and at least watch from safe distance. Keep eyes on it in case anything changed before the sheriff arrived. I said no again, and this time I meant it as much for myself as for him, because I recognized the old instinct in both of us and knew exactly how it had ended for other people I'd worked cases for. We didn't stay put. In the end, not entirely. I compromised with myself the way I'd compromised with Milo earlier, and walked us to the trailhead itself. Close enough to flag responding units and fast, far enough that we weren't anywhere near the actual clearing, a decision I've replayed enough times since to know it was the right one, and still second-guessed anyway. The way you do with every decision from a night that goes sideways regardless of what you chose. The first patrol vehicle arrived at 18 minutes, followed within another few by 2 more, plus what turned out to be a County K-9 unit, and I gave the responding sergeant the same structured briefing I'd given dispatch, watching something settle into his face that told me he recognized the format even before I mentioned the 14 years. He didn't waste time asking me to repeat myself. He asked if I could walk a deputy back to the clearing at a safe distance and point it out from cover, and I said yes before Milo could volunteer himself for the same job instead. We moved back in with 2 deputies, staying well off the direct approach, and I got them eyes on the structure from the outcrop I'd used before, the same lean-to, the same pickup. One of the 2 men from earlier now visible pacing near the vehicles in a way that read, even from that distance, like someone who suspected something had changed and hadn't yet worked out what. The deputies called it in and held position rather than moving on the structure alone, waiting on the additional units the sergeant had already requested, which felt like exactly the right call, and also like the longest 10 minutes of standing still I've experienced since I turned in my badge. Both of us, deputies and civilians alike, watching that clearing for any sign the 2 men inside had made the same read on their situation that we had. That read arrived for them almost exactly when it arrived for us. One of the men suddenly moving fast toward the pickup, engine turning over within seconds, gravel spraying as he reversed hard out of the brush and onto a rough track I hadn't clocked on my earlier pass, cutting away from the clearing at a speed that told every one of us watching that whatever chance we'd had at a clean, contained arrest had just ended. The deputies broke from cover the second the truck moved, radioing a vehicle description and direction of travel, while sprinting toward the shed itself rather than the fleeing pickup, prioritizing, correctly, whoever was still inside that structure over the man, now putting distance between himself and all of us. I went with them without being asked, old instinct overriding every rational reason I should have stayed back with Milo, who came right behind me despite every previous version of me telling him not to. The shed door came off its hinges under a deputy's boot, and inside, in bad light and worse air, we found a kid, 19, maybe 20, wrists zip-tied to a support post, dehydrated and shaking, but conscious, alive, saying please again, the same word I'd heard from 100 yards off an hour earlier, except now close enough that it landed like something physical. A deputy had the ties cut inside of a minute, and I've done a lot of jobs in my life that felt worse than watching that particular not come free. The second man, the one who'd been near the pickup earlier, not the one who'd fled, wasn't in the shed and wasn't immediately visible anywhere in the clearing, which meant we had one subject actively fleeing by vehicle and a second one unaccounted for on foot somewhere in terrain none of us had fully mapped. A detail the lead deputy relayed to responding units with a tightness in his voice that told me he understood exactly how that math could still go wrong for everyone still standing in that clearing. Milo, crouched by the freed kid helping him drink water from someone's bottle, was the one who spotted it first. Motion at the tree lane on the clearing's far side, brief, low, gone before either deputy could get a weapon up, but enough for both of them to reposition immediately, putting themselves between the tree lane and the 2 civilians and the victim, which is exactly the moment I understood, with total clarity, how far outside my old authority I actually was now, reduced to standing where I was told and trusting people half my age with a badge I no longer carried. The second man broke from the tree lane maybe 90 seconds later, not running at us, but running past, toward a stretch of creek downstream that a deputy later confirmed offered a crossing point on a land outside their immediate jurisdiction, and the 2 deputies split, one pursuing on foot, one staying with us and the kid, and calling for additional units to cut him off farther down. A decision made in seconds that I recognized, even from the outside now, as exactly the kind of call I used to make 100 times a shift without ever fully appreciating how much weight it carried. We got the kid. His name was Ezra. We learned, 19, missing for 6 days according to a report that would come in from 2 counties over once his description got circulated. Back toward the trailhead as fast as his condition allowed, Milo taking one side and me the other. Both of us half carrying him over ground that felt considerably longer retreating than it had walking in that morning under entirely different circumstances. The fleeing pickup made it maybe 4 miles before a spike strip and 2 patrol units ended that particular part of the afternoon. The driver taken into custody without further incident. According to the radio traffic, I overheard secondhand from an EMT working on Ezra back at the campground. The second man, the one who'd run for the creek, wasn't found that day or the next, a fact the sheriff's department confirmed to me directly a week later when they called for a follow-up statement, by which point Milo and I were 3 states away, and I still checked that call's caller ID twice before answering it. Ezra went out by ambulance within the hour, stable, talking in fragments to anyone who'd listened about a highway pickup gone wrong 6 days earlier that had turned into something considerably worse than a bad hitchhiking decision. Details I only got secondhand and have deliberately not gone looking for more of, because some habits from the job I've actually managed to leave behind, and knowing exactly how bad a case gets after the fact is one of them. Milo and I sat in the campground that evening giving statements to 2 different detectives for the better part of 3 hours, both of us running the same events through slightly different memories, and I watched my nephew handle that process with a steadiness that surprised me. The same kid who 2 days earlier had wanted to reenact a Jesse James stunt off a footbridge now giving precise, useful testimony to investigators twice his experience level. We stayed in Garretson 2 extra nights at the department's request, giving follow-up statements, and in my case, fielding a long, careful conversation with a detective named Yin who wanted the full version of my read on the scene, professional to professional, a conversation that reminded me uncomfortably of exactly how much I did and didn't miss about the job, both feelings present in roughly equal, uncomfortable measure. The second man was picked up 9 days later. We learned eventually, 3 counties away, on an unrelated traffic stop that happened to run his plates against the right database at the right time. The kind of unglamorous, entirely ordinary resolution that most of my old cases actually ended with, whatever the true crime shows want people to believe about dramatic final confrontations. Ezra recovered. Physically, according to the one update the department was willing to share with us, as witnesses rather than family. Milo asked me, our first night back on the road afterward, whether this was what the job had actually been like for 14 years, and I gave him the honest answer instead of the easy one. That most of it was paperwork and waiting and calls that resolved into nothing worth telling anyone about later, and that the rare days like this one were exactly why the job had taken as much out of me as it had, because you can't titrate your nervous system down to paperwork level calm between the days. That actually mattered. He didn't ask much else about it after that, which I understood as him processing something rather than losing interest, and I caught him, a few days later, looking up basic first aid and de-escalation courses on his phone without mentioning it to me directly, a small thing I noticed and decided not to comment on, the same way he'd apparently decided not to comment on watching me revert, for one afternoon, into someone I'd spent 3 years trying to stop being. We finished the loop through South Dakota over the following week, mostly quiet, mostly easy, both of us circling back to Split Rock and Devil's Gulch in conversation more than either of us circled back to it physically, the Jesse James legend taking on a different weight in hindsight, a man running from armed pursuit through that exact terrain a century and a half apart from another man doing the same thing for entirely different reasons. The land apparently just built for that particular kind of story regardless of the century. I still think about the word please more than I'd like to, both versions of it. The one that reached me across 100 yards of empty creek bank, and the one Ezra kept repeating hours later in a language that had nothing to do with fear anymore, just relief looking for somewhere to land. 14 years on the job gave me plenty of practice hearing that word in bad circumstances. It never got easier, and I'm not sure, watching Milo process his own version of that afternoon, that it's supposed to. I got one more call from Detective Yin about 6 weeks later, a courtesy update rather than anything requiring further statement. The second man's case moving toward trial, Ezra's family reached and grateful in the specific, exhausted way families get after the worst version of a story turns out to have an ending. I thanked her, meant it, and didn't ask any of the follow-up questions the old detective in me still badly wanted answered. Milo and I don't talk about that afternoon much anymore. Not because either of us is avoiding it exactly, but because it's settled, the way these things do, into something that doesn't need relitigating every time we're back on a quiet stretch of road together. He still brings up the Jesse James jump sometimes, though usually at exactly the moment I'd rather he didn't, grinning about it in a way that tells me he's decided, consciously or not, to hold on to the version of that trip that started as an adventure rather than the one it actually turned into. I don't have a clean way to end this one, professionally or otherwise. The case closed the way most of my old cases closed, with a resolution on paper and a residue that doesn't show up in any file, sitting somewhere behind my sternum on quiet drives, surfacing whenever I catch myself reading a rest stop or a trailhead the way I used to read a scene, checking for the version of the place that isn't mowed and signed for anyone before I could stop myself from looking. Six stories, one state, and if there's a thread running under all of them, it isn't a killer or a legend or a storm. It's the land itself. How much of South Dakota is built to look empty from a distance and turn out to be anything, but once you're standing in it alone after dark. That's the thing about this state that doesn't come through on a map. From the interstate, it reads as wide open and uncomplicated, grass, sky, the occasional butte. Get off that interstate, though follow a Forest Service spur past Rockford, or a fence line out past Vermilion, or a creek bed cutting through pink quartzsite outside Garrettson, and the emptiness stops feeling like nothing and starts feeling like room. Room for a cabin nobody records with the county. Room for a fire circle in a ravine the Dakota people have been calling by the same wary name for longer than the states have borders. Room for a mound on a dead flat prairie that Lewis and Clark themselves went out of their way to avoid getting too close to. Every person in these six stories made some version of the same mistake, and it's worth naming, because it's the mistake that makes all of this possible in the first place. They trusted the emptiness. They looked at a locked cabin, a cold fire pit, a quiet stretch of grass, a rise in the prairie no taller than a curb, and read it as safe, because nothing was moving and nobody was around. Out here, that's exactly backward. The moment nothing seems to be happening is usually the moment something already has its eyes on you. You'll notice none of these six had much in common on paper. A couple looking for a wilder road, two old friends chasing a legend for camera, a father and daughter caught by weather that doesn't care how much either of them knows about rock, a woman alone learning the difference between solitude and being watched, a couple 4 months into something new, standing on a landform that's been unsettling visitors for 2 centuries running. A retired detective who thought he'd left this kind of afternoon behind him for good. Different ages, different reasons for being out here, different threats entirely. A man with an axe, a fire in the trees, a wall of water, a presence that may or may not have been real, lights on a mound, and men with guns holding somebody's kid against a support post. What they share is smaller and colder than any of that. Every one of them found out how far they were from help before they found out what they actually needed help for. South Dakota doesn't hand you its worst all at once either. It's patient. A dead phone signal here, a road that turns to gumbo there, a drumbeat carried up a ravine on air too still to explain it, a GPS reading that's off by 300 yards and then, an hour later, isn't. The state builds its horror the way it built its buttes, slow, one thin layer at a time, until you look up and the whole shape of the thing is standing over you and you can't remember exactly when it got that tall. Not every one of these people made it out whole. Some did, and came back different, checking locks they never used to check, calling someone every couple of days just to hear a voice, unable to throw away a redstone they can't explain owning. Some didn't come back at all, and the case files on them sit open the way so many case files in the state sit open, technically active, practically silent, one more name added to a list of people the land decided to keep. That's South Dakota's particular cruelty. It rarely explains itself afterward. You don't get a clean answer for what was in that shed, or who lit that fire, or why the water came up that fast, or whether anyone was ever really standing at that trailing at all. You get a story and a scar, and you get to decide for yourself, same as every person in these 6, how much of it you actually believe by daylight. If you've made it this far, you already know the drill. This state's done, but the road doesn't end here. There's another one waiting, another stretch of highway with its own quiet places and its own reasons nobody stays parked in them for long. Same rules apply wherever we go next. Trust the empty ground a little less than it wants you to. Lock the doors even when the air's good. And if you ever find yourself somewhere flat and quiet and undisturbed looking, somewhere that feels a little too easy to have all to yourself, remember these 6 and ask yourself before you get comfortable whether it's actually as empty as it looks or whether it's just waiting for you to think so. That's South Dakota. Thanks for riding along.